Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to what I decided to call Dynamically Scaling macOS, How, When, and Why. That was not the first title. First, I went with Mac in a Mac in a Mac. Turns out, we'll get into this later, nested virtualization doesn't let you nest a Mac inside of a Mac inside of a Mac, so not quite. I liked the levels of abstraction, but I couldn't really find a lot of folks that knew Matryoshka dolls, the little Russian nesting dolls. And then I went maybe a little bit Shakespearean, and that kind of ran off the page. So biggest question, of course, is that, or biggest question, statement I'd like to make first. This is actually just me talking. My statements and opinions are my own, and you probably want to have an idea of whose statements or whose opinions they are. So that's not me. This is one of, I had a little bit of fun with a few different image generators. There are three images that are actually not generated by AI in this. This is obviously not one of them. I also don't have a shirt that cute. So I'm Dave Siederer. I've been around Apple stuff for a pretty good long time. Currently, I am an expert in things around Mac in the cloud for things like AWS. But prior to that, I did a whole lot of work around introducing deployment technologies in the very early days, pre-Apple Configurator. Had a lot of fun. I was very, very young at an Apple store once. And my job title at the PR firm that I'd worked at, the closest thing I could come up with is anything that would concern you if you dropped it into a bath with you. So as far as real images go, this is one, and this is proof that I've been at this for a little bit of a while. Myself in 1990 with my LC. So while we're at my beginning, let's head to the beginning of, well, I guess, Macs and the kind of cloud computing in general. And this is honestly a personal theory that I like to call the pendulum. And it's just something that I've kind of noticed as time goes on. It's a fairly simple thing, just the idea that computing power, the stuff that you're working on, the hard work that gets done for what you're doing, is sometimes it's going to be done in the cloud, on a server, somewhere else. Sometimes that's going to be done right locally. So we see that local data processing to what's usually bigger hardware in the cloud, and then the hardware gets better on the desktop. So everything that you kind of start in that processing, just this idea that instead of just doing something locally, you can actually reach out and say, I need a server to do that for me. And then, who knows, a couple years later, the power of that server is in something like an M4. So that pendulum just kind of keeps on swinging back and forth. And I'd say that's a better thing for all of us to have more powerful stuff. So back to, again, we're starting from the beginning, when computing was mysterious and important. So networking was kind of like waiting your turn at times. Multitasking actually was something that came a little bit later, but you were still using what were called dumb terminals. And that's not an insult, that's actually what they were called. It's basically text that's coming over a connection. And I know we're skipping a lot here, but we're going to, and to take a look at the cloud, data centers are basically, when we're looking at the cloud, there have been data centers before. So define cloud. And that's always a question I've been asked. It's a question that I asked, actually, because the first thing that I'd heard is, oh, the cloud is somebody else's computer. And that's sort of correct, honestly. It's not that far off. But really what you want to be thinking about, rather than somebody else's computer, is that it's almost somebody else's computer with resources on demand. So you can actually take what you're doing and kind of break that down. Rather than just having one chunk of code running on one server, you've got multiple routines, things like serverless, that are actually going to basically fire off when you need them, rather than just kind of sitting there waiting for something to happen. And the neat thing is, when it comes to cloud, if you get popular, it scales with you. And there are cost controls in place if you get a little too popular. Now going over basically what each kind of layer of abstraction is, and we're going to start with the basic, bare metal. It's a Mac. It's running macOS on a Mac. It's probably the Mac that you have. It's the oldest original way to get a Mac. They're made of matter, and the license allows for your OS to run on hardware, that Mac hardware, specifically Apple hardware, and 2 VMs on top of that. And we're going to get into the virtualization in just a bit of what that means and how that gets used. You also can receive, and this is coming from someone who, I'm not a lawyer, but I have read the macOS software license agreement a bit too much. A show of hands, who else has enjoyed that document? Wow, we've got 3. We're going to start a book club, the licensing book club. So yeah, it is possible to remote into a Mac with say a PC or anything running over VNC. And if you have another Mac, you can actually start a separate user session. It would have to come through something like Apple Remote Desktop or screen sharing. But it is actually possible to, instead of take over the screen share, say, I'm going to start a session under this separate user account and actually have that running concurrently. And of course, automated enrollment is dependent on the chain of ownership. Again, with the basics, how do you get a Mac? Your friendly neighborhood Apple Store or Apple reseller, of course. You can, if you want to, try to steal a Mac, but it is not recommended. You will probably be caught, and chain of ownership makes automated device enrollment a little bit of a challenge when it's stolen. However long it physically takes to you, though, to get to you, is how long you can basically kind of scale up. That's one of those limitations of the physical. It's a great device, but it does take some time to actually get to you. And depending on your reseller, there are some that do offer things like pre-caching or pre-configuration, something where you can take more of a baseline rather in conjunction with something like an automated device enrollment. So virtualization, and I've done my best to banish the Zs from virtualization, so hopefully I'm localized correctly. So virtualization simply is running a Mac inside of your Mac. So before Apple Silicon, there were other virtualization vendors, folks like VMware, ESXi, where it was kind of a bigger solution. And that is something that has changed, actually, with Apple Silicon and the virtualization framework. So the framework, and the neat thing about this is, the unneat thing about this is, remember we were all talking about that license? The license also does say you are entitled to 2 concurrent VMs at a time. The virtualization framework does enforce this. So keep in mind, if you do try to start a 3rd virtual machine, you are probably going to end up with, you will end up with an error, but it's only concurrency. You can store however many you'd like and just fire them off one by one. And Sequoia, this is relatively new, has support for Apple accounts in virtual machines as well. So for things like, I've personally tested iMessage even, being able to do some of the more intricate Apple account stuff from inside of a VM has definitely helped out in testing. So some cloud providers, and this is not all, but I do want to mention that sometimes you will get a virtual machine, and that very much is one of those things that can be advantageous, because virtual machines, although performance is dependent on exactly what the specification of that Mac is and how many virtual machines they're running concurrently, you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. Like instantly boot, saving configurations kind of exactly where they are, having these files rather than having to wait for boots. You actually are just kind of frozen in place. So yeah, the ups and downs of virtualization in itself, very, very good when it comes to parallel tasks without necessarily too much compute demand. And preserving that configuration, again, at that exact point in time, being able to kind of freeze the bits as you need them, so you can go back and say, okay, well, here's here's where we were, and we can get right back to it. Again, it's not a 50-50 split. It would be nice if it was, but there is some hypervisor involved in macOS. So typically, if you're running one virtual machine, you'll be getting a decent bit of power. If you're running two virtual machines, you do want to consider, is it important that I do two of these at the same time because they're low impact? Or is it more important that I go for maybe just one at a time, rapid fire? One thing that's wonderful, running beta versions of macOS. Not everyone, I always say I live dangerously. I run beta versions of everything on all of my devices, which means that sometimes I'm less than reachable at times. But I call it my civic duty. I like to do my reporting, my feedback assistanting, and get that before it reaches other folks. Keep in mind, with Apple Silicon 2, you can only go so far back, specifically to typically what, and I apologize, I forgot to write this down, but there is a version of macOS, I believe it's 12.01, where virtualization actually started out. And I think the 0.0 release actually was just about to come out. So testing with management, and that's something literally covered just a moment ago before I came on stage incredibly by Rob. Unfortunately, I don't have a time machine, so I can't send you back, but these are all recorded, so definitely check it out. There is some guidance involved in that and how best to utilize that. So the feature set is primarily just that virtualization framework on Apple Silicon. So you are going to see it's not the same features on every single project, but you will see definitely that similar pool in almost the same way that if you've looked at MDM protocols, you have that almost commonality where everyone's going to have the profile stuff, for example. And keep in mind, portability too is not necessarily a guarantee. There are more than one virtualization technology out here, and that's not necessarily going to mean you can take one VM and move it directly to another. So, how do you grow your own? Well, we've been hearing about how to bake them, and we've got that in this list here, but downloading an app is really the best way to get started. If you use Homebrew, you can grab any of these. UTM is one of the newer ones. Tart was mentioned earlier as just command line. You can get this running really, really quickly. Virtual Buddy usually has that's got a bit more of an orchestratability than some of the other free offerings. QEMU actually does sit at the heart of some of these virtualization layers as well. So if you did actually just want to run it on its own. We also have old standards like VirtualBox, which I'm actually still using to run my Pi-hole at home. And there are commercial solutions. These can be really important. Virtu Anka, I mentioned orchestratability. This is more on an enterprise scale to be able to have that registry and also to have this unified between your x86 and your Apple Silicon. Parallels Desktop, again, this is a name that we all know, probably. And I remember setting up Parallels 1.0 on an Xserve. And yeah, that's still not only still going, but still working incredibly well with Apple Silicon. And I will mention too, because VMware Fusion is still available, it's definitely may not be as capable as most of the other solutions out there, but there's a free license even for business that's out there. So that was every time I kind of hear, I've been kind of bringing in, I try to test everything, and and VMware Fusion is actually still on there for that. So on to containerization. Now, the reason I say always smiling here is because of our artificial intelligence. Every time I asked it for an image of containerization, it had the happiest face in the world. I don't know why these containers are so happy, but they really are. So very, very simply, a container is basically a VM, but not all of one. You're getting the app that you want and all of its dependencies, the stuff that it needs. I say one file here, that's not really correct. It's one one directory, basically, something addressable. But this is something that you do see a lot in Linux server-side applications especially. macOS is, I would say, Licensing historically has made containerization a bit more challenging, but containerization is very much something that is active. So who's containering today? Probably the most significant is actually at our show right now. Mac Stadium has Orca, which is fully orchestratable. There are also options like Docker Desktop for using a little bit more locally. And I did want to check in, the Darwin Containers project is actually up to 0.0.9. I am still watching, so I'm hoping, competition's always good when it comes to software. So let's take a look at a Mac in a data center, which can mean a few different things, because the idea is you get a Mac where it needs to be. The commitment times, the locations, how long that takes to get set up, that does vary between providers. There is, though, and this is a bit of a universality, and again, written to that lovely license agreement, 24-hour minimum allocation period. So it does require that you are in possession of that Mac for at least a day. Past that, there's not any sort of regulation. So a lot of providers do have different methods. A lot of the time, you may just see something like a 30-day commitment, for example. That way, there's not really a 24-hour question. Those setup times do vary. Again, that really does depend. Sometimes you will end up with a VM. Sometimes you'll have bare metal. Everyone that I've ever worked with has been incredibly upfront about what they are offering. So that's I wouldn't say you'll ever be surprised by this. It's just I do like to mention that these are options. And storage I also like to mention, because a lot of the time you think about, you buy a Mac, get an SSD that's a little too big and kick yourself for how expensive it was, but a lot of the storage can be something that's on the pricier side if you're just talking about local storage. Being able to do something like use a NAS or use some sort of a network storage gives you that ability to say, okay, I need 200 gigabytes today. I'm going to need a terabyte tomorrow. And being able to change that, being able to expand and even share. So of course, I want to talk about what the heck is the Amazon one, because I do have a little expertise on it. So these are AWS EC2 Mac instances, and they are actually bare metal. So that is a Mac Mini inside of a tray. The green board down there is providing storage and networking over Thunderbolt to the actual Mac Mini. So the boot drive is coming over that connection. You're not using the SSD to actually boot this or to interact with it. All of your information is coming right along that wire, which also means that it is something that is encryptable on the back end as well. And the neat thing is, it's bare metal. It's type 2 virtualizationable, which is not quite a word. But yes, you can run VMs on top of an EC2 Mac, because it is just when you boot one of these up, you get a Mac. And then things get weird because there's images. Really, images are kind of undead in the cloud. You can actually, it's a little bit like it used to be, set up a Mac in the cloud and take a snapshot. So taking that snapshot, you can take that snapshot and say, okay, everything from here on out, I want all of my newly launched Macs to look like this. And that actually will carry along with some exceptions. As we all know, MDM is something that's very device dependent, and we'll take a look at what enrollment looks like in just a bit and how that gets corrected. And of course, that idea of resizable storage, just being able to say, I need more, I need something faster. That's absolutely something that you're able to do just straight through the console. So yeah, storage and networking over Thunderbolt. And possibly my favorite part, there is a Pokey robot in that black box around the corner is housing a robot finger that actually is booting, rebooting, doing the things that it needs to do for firmware updates on the Mac itself. Our engineers actually found this to be the most dependable way to go about it. So this was really built with a lot of developer workflows in mind, specifically CI/CD. So there are integrations already with tools like Jenkins You're able to say, I have an EC2 fleet. I'd like to bring this in as a worker, and I know there's blogs available on that, and even just in the Jenkins documentation itself too. And you can start one of these in a whole lot of different ways. You can click on through the console, you can use the CLI, you can use the API. We'll get into IAC in just a bit. And they're ready in about 6 to 20 minutes from the moment that you launch them. I'll throw into one more time just that there is that 24-hour minimum. But that is actually, once that 24 hours elapses, you're billed by the second, and you can let go of it at any other second, and you stop billing from there. So to give you an idea, these are the instances that are available today. We actually have one x86 Mac, which is called Mac 1. And everything that starts with Mac 2 is Apple Silicon. We did not know the M1 was coming out, so that may be why Mac 1 was called Mac 1. And it's a decent range of different devices. So we have an M1 Mac Mini, we have the M2, M2 Pro, and the M1 Ultra. So if you do need suddenly something with 128 gigabytes of RAM for a few days, it is something you can have in a few commands. So let's actually take a look at what that command is. We'll break this down. So first, I'm going to use the AWS CLI. So I can actually install this with Homebrew. And then I'm going to set a few things to basically tell this CLI what am I doing. What do I want, which is an EC2 instance. I want an M2 Pro. I'm playing I got a big plan. I need power. I'm telling it what image to use. So I've got an AMI ID in there, Amazon Machine Image. When you connect to an EC2 Mac, you're actually connecting by default with SSH before, unless you basically configure it otherwise later on. So I am actually mentioning an EC2 key pair as well in here, and a region and availability zone. This is where it's going, and a little bit more concentrated where it's going. I'm going to have two commands here, and these will be broken down in a couple of lines. Allocate hosts. So there's basically two steps to getting a Mac from Amazon. The first thing, you have to allocate a host, and then you have to start the instance. So allocating the host, this is where billing starts, and this is where I'm telling it where it needs to go. I'm turning on a feature called auto placement. This is very much not required, but this basically means that in my next step, I don't have to tell it which Mac that I want. I can just say I want one of these, and it'll say we've got one in our inventory. Let's boot it on up. Host recovery, I'm mentioning here, is off because that is not supported today. And you actually can specify a quantity. So yes, we're doing this for 1. We could do this for 10. We could do this for, well, however many one would need, or one that wouldn't get one in trouble with one's boss. And of course, the instance type, we're passing along that variable from earlier. So this is going to give us a host ID. This is going to give us a host that means that I have a Mac. It's almost like getting handed a Mac and saying, this is yours. Now do what you want to do on it. So that's where run instances is coming in. So again, we're specifying the region. We want to make sure that we're speaking to the right area first. We're going to say what instance type again. And since we did that auto placement before, I don't have to do anything else. I just have to say I need one of those, and it knows I've got one of those. We're passing it the image ID and that SSH key name as well. And finally, placement. This is a bit more of a unique thing to EC2 Mac because these are dedicated hosts. You actually do have to just specify that the tenancy is host. So this is CLI, basically how to get a single Mac from the terminal. But what about if you had a bit bigger dreams? Infrastructure is code. There's a quote that I always liked. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everyone can really easily understand, which is actually Malcolm X's message to the grassroots, which you may also know from the opening of Living Color's Cult of Personality. But the idea is that you are kind of talking in a language everybody understands here. It's kind of like an API for clouds and resources and infrastructure. If you've used Terraform, is probably one of the largest, but things like Chef, Puppet, and Ansible, where you're basically saying what you want to build, how you want it, and where you want it. Some IACs actually do also offer multiple services. So you're not necessarily saying, okay, I'm going to build something on AWS, and I can build something else on GCP, and this could actually be one document. So as the example here, I'm going to use what's called Terraform. This is one of those cross-platform platforms. And this sample is exactly what we did a moment ago in the CLI. The only difference is we're just creating two resources instead. So we're creating a host, just in the same way, with those same attributes, just laid out a little bit differently. And we're creating an instance. Again, same attributes, laid out a little bit differently. This can be, though, in a document, very repeatable, very sendable to anyone else. So when it does come time to say, okay, we want to get our entire infrastructure, you can have it in a JSON file or a YAML file and have a whole lot of that already just ready to roll. And I do want to mention auto-scaling here because if you've used any of the Amazon EC2 stuff, there is auto-scaling a lot for Linux, for other instance types. So yeah, once we've seen our code for a single Mac at a time, the idea of auto-scaling is to launch as many as you need to with as little friction as possible. So these are launched automatically using a launch template, which again, we're kind of getting back to what did we just specify a moment ago? We had the image ID, we had the device type. All of that is stored in a launch template almost exactly the same. You can actually scale based on a few different metrics, and by a few I mean almost anything you can think of. CPU and RAM pressure is probably the most common, but we have some folks who are saying, okay, when the disk starts getting thrashed, that means we're working. AWS CloudWatch also offers a host of options coming out of the unified logging to get more information out to the AWS console. And of course, you can just do it manually or just send a command. So that can be, if auto-scaling means that at 3 p.m. on Friday, you know that Joe's getting up, you can scale up at 2:30 and he won't have any problems. So the trick here, because EC2 Mac is a little bit different with those dedicated hosts, there's an extra thing called AWS License Manager. And the neat thing is, first of all, we're not talking about something where we're paying extra. This is actually, the service itself is free. And folks that are in this room, I'm pretty sure, have used VPP/apps and books for free licenses. And you can almost think of this in a similar way, where we're taking a kind of a quote-unquote license and using that to say, okay, this is how many Macs that this can be a maximum of. The workflow with this in place is nearly identical to what you see of Linux otherwise. And do remember, once more, 24 hours, do plan for scale in, because that's once something goes out, it's not able to be given back for that day. The neat thing about this setup, though, is that you don't have to worry about it. You can actually have this auto-release. So once you're done with your instance, once you're done with that image, you're not using it anymore, that license manager can actually take care of kind of the pain work of, okay, now you won't have to pay for it anymore as long as we're out of the 24-hour period. So obviously, I like my history, so I'm going to foist a little bit more history to you. We've talked about getting a Mac, and we've gotten a Mac in just about as many ways as I can think of at the very least. So let's talk about connecting to one. Early networking, I don't know if anybody unplugged their Style Rider and plugged it into their friend's computer to get a game of Bolo or Spectre going, but yes. That was local talk way back in the day. Ethernet's been around a long time. There were some weird connectors for Ethernet. Highly recommend a good Wikipedia search. And things like Token Ring. I mentioned waiting your turn on a network. That is literally what Token Ring does. It'll go around the network and say, okay, this is who needs something. We're going to stop for them. So this whole idea of networking in general, this is a very abbreviated overview, had brought this idea of the Macintosh Office, that sounds really cool. In the 80s, it might not have been ready yet. The Macintosh Office was, the anchor to that was actually an Apple Lisa or a Mac XL at that point. So it was a little bit of an interesting time to be doing some of the early Apple networking. And of course, to get access from a Mac to something else too, we've got things like RDP, the Microsoft Remote Desktop Protocol, or terminal services. Just the idea that you're getting that access to to something else in an efficient way, or just getting to that GUI. And of course, VNC. It's built into every macOS. It's part of screen sharing, and allows. I'm trying to think if there's a. I'm trying to think of a platform without a VNC client on it, and I'm not sure if I can. I'm going to look and see if we can find one for the Nintendo 3DS sometime next week. But even things like emulation, rather than virtualization, this was, again, the early days. If you needed to get Windows from your Mac, and you didn't just have a Windows box on that you could RDP to, you could use stuff like soft PC and soft Windows for DOS and actually emulation, and it was incredibly slow. And it was usually very frustrating, but it was cool when you could do it. And finally, Dave, which is not me. This was actually one of the first screen sharing protocols from a company called Thursby Software, who I think is, I'm going to misquote, I'm not sure what their current status is right now. But first of all, I love the name, and I like the fact that it's at port 3283, which on a phone keypad, that spells Dave. It's clever. So yeah, access. Again, we're covering the basics real quick. Physical Mac. How do you access a physical Mac? However you want. It's input, it's keyboard, it's a trackpad, mouse, voiceover. I just heard BCIs are available for switch control coming soon. That's going to be so cool. I really do want to see what my brain does with my Mac without any filters between them. I'm not sure if anyone else does. And of course, a VM, you do usually get that presented on boot, but as we'd been mentioned before, you can use, you can boot that headless and actually use stuff like Apple Remote Desktop or screen sharing and get the cool features that you don't get from just a bare VM window, things like clipboard sharing. Now, accessing a Mac from beyond can be a little bit different. I'd mentioned earlier SSH for the AWS Cloud Macs. That's the default way of getting your access. That's so you can SSH directly in for CLI access. VNC, again, that's usually 2 or 3 commands away from that. And more advanced stuff, if your enterprise is using Citrix VDA is working with Mac today. HP Anywhere, formerly known as Teradici, also Parsec. These are technologies, a lot of these are using, I don't want to say cooler stuff, but it's things like your, you being able to encrypt that video stream, being able to actually have your video rather than, basically compressed better and more secure. And you can do cool things like USB forwarding as well. You can actually take something like a smart card reader, even a phone, and directly just connect that in to a remote machine with, there's a few different pieces of software that do that, FlexiHub, Virtual here, and these I've personally tested and really had some good experiences with. And finally, I just want to go over enrollment types because we're talking about all these different types of Macs and how to get to them. Now we're going to need to manage them. So just going over, and these, again, some of this may be a little bit old news to you, but agent-based enrollment. It's typically proprietary to your admin tool vendor. It's something that is usually easy to automate because it's just an installer package. And it cannot do some of the newer things like issuing MDM commands. It can't handle profiles, and more stuff seems to be getting to be into that part of things, that profile requirement. Mobile app management, something came along, and this is a really great way to make sure that just the app itself is kept in a secure posture. But outside of that app, there really is not much control over the rest of the system. That can be a plus, and that can be a minus. So MDM itself, we all know ADE. ADE requires hardware ownership, or a whole lot of calls to a reseller to make sure your hardware ownership. No. You can also, of course, put something into ADE with something like, Apple Configurator, and have that totally automated after network connection workflow. But you do need that hardware, and if you really want to test that workflow, you need hardware that's registered to it. User-initiated enrollment is what I'd almost call it kind of the classic. It's where you take a profile, you open that profile, and you can actually enroll a device almost as simple as that with some authorizations. Usually requires user interaction, and we'll take a look at and see how that may be a little bit different here. And I'll mention user enrollment just for completion's sake, because everyone forgets about this one. It is very privacy focused and says, okay, I just want to manage apps for this user. And finally, of course, the bigger stuff, the account-driven device enrollment, account-driven user enrollment, very similar to that profile-based enrollment or user enrollment, but using an Apple account to lead that. Again, this one requires typically user interaction without, unless we're talking about some cloud things here. I do have some experimental support for this in my repo, Enroll EC2 Mac. And just to go real quick over the general architecture here, this is how the enrollment goes. The Mac is brought up, and the Enroll EC2 Mac script runs at the beginning. It has access to credentials for AWS Secrets Manager. That's holding the stuff that it needs to communicate with, in this case, the Jamf API. And the Jamf API is going to send that create invitation code back down to that script. The script itself is assembling an MDM enrollment profile from that, finishes the enrollment itself, automation, and you have that constant communication between the Mac and the MDM. And as for what that looks like, it kind of looks like this. This is one of the neat things is I always say no hands. So this is actually happening completely automated without really any intervention whatsoever. As the setup for this, I'm going to show the setup is probably an extra minute that I'll show in the next session that I have with Marcus coming on later. But what we're seeing here is full automation. This is now a Mac that is completely enrolled into management and is able to be addressed, able to be pushed profiles to, able to be queried. And there is actually support coming, again, experimental for account-driven device enrollment. I won't go through the steps, but I will say it looks very similar. But yeah, just to kind of bring everything back together, I want to offer up definitely a couple of resources, anything that folks want to understand about the Amazon Mac stuff. I've got my personal GitHub up here. I love domains, so I own scripteditor.app. I also love AppleScript, so I own scripteditor.app. But yeah, feel free to also, I love to be reached out to, and obviously I like talking about this stuff a lot. So yeah, I'm available on Mac admins, and I guess I didn't figure out a great way to end this other than thank you so much for not only being awake and here, but for being an awesome audience, and thanks.
You know if I bat the sea, no, there's no wave that can stop me. When the sky turns black, I'll be the light you
Good
need.
morning,
I'll go
MacAd
to
25. We now have a short break. The next session will start at 11:45 with Tim Standing.